June 4th, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia, 6:14 a.m. Before I tell you what happened to these men, I need you to understand who they were. These were not broken soldiers, not frightened boys. The 1,850 men descending from that transport ship were Afrika Korps veterans. Rommel's finest. Desert warriors. They had driven the British back to Egypt. They had earned the Iron Cross in conditions that destroyed lesser armies. 3,000 miles of campaign across North African sand. They had survived the worst the war could throw at them. And then they stepped onto the dock at Norfolk, Virginia. And something happened that no artillery shell had ever managed to do. What they were about to witness would not just shake their beliefs, it would erase them. Completely. Permanently. And the most extraordinary thing is, America wasn't even trying. Unofizier Hermann Butcher gripped the gangplank railing, legs still swaying. 14 days at sea will do that. His eyes moved across the dock, then stopped. White men and black men working side by side. No hierarchy, no tension. Women in coveralls running overhead cranes. A brass band playing swing music within sight of warships. Children selling newspapers at the gate. Nobody fled at the sight of enemy uniforms. Some civilians glanced at the column of gray prisoners, then looked away again, mildly interested. The way you look at a delayed train. Die spinnin', die Amerikaner. Hermann Butcher, whispering to the man behind him. These Americans are crazy. He had no idea how right he was, and no idea how completely that craziness was about to take him apart. He had been prepared for hatred, for humiliation, for punishment. He had not been prepared for this. No propaganda, no loudspeakers, no crafted messaging, just America. And it was going to destroy everything these men believed. Tunisia, North Africa, May 13th, 1943. To understand what happened to these men in America, you need to understand what was already inside their heads. The Afrika Korps veterans who surrendered at Tunis were not conscripts. They were decorated, battle-tested, professionals. General von Arnim surrendered with 275,000 German and Italian soldiers. The largest Axis capitulation of the war. The desert campaign was finished. These men were now prisoners. But they had a complete ideology already installed. America, they had been told since childhood, was a decadent, mongrelized nation. Weak, divided, corrupt, on the verge of collapse. Its soldiers were soft. Its racial mixing made it biologically incapable. America could not fight a sustained war. It simply did not have the character. These weren't opinions they held. This was the shape of the world, the way water is wet. They crossed the Atlantic on Liberty ships. What they didn't know was that each ship had been built in under a week. Kaiser Shipyards was producing 3 per day. The hold they sat in was one of 2,710 identical hulls. They were sailing to a nation they believed was collapsing, on a ship assembled faster than most German factories could build a single tank. Over 425,000 German POWs. 500 camps. 45 states. What happened inside those camps would become one of the most successful psychological operations in modern history. Almost nobody knows the story. Camp Hearn, Texas, August 1943, 6 p.m. They were processed, photographed, issued uniforms, olive drab, large white PW letters stenciled across the back. For Oberreiter Hans Müller, tank gunner, Stuttgart, 11 months of desert warfare. These were the first clean clothes he had worn in 6 months. No holes, no patches. He pressed the fabric between his fingers and went very still. Then they were fed. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, white bread with real butter, coffee, actual coffee, and apple pie. Müller had lost 34 pounds. He sat with his tray and calculated the calories, then stopped calculating, because the number didn't make sense. 1 meal. The Americans were feeding their prisoners more in a single sitting than the Wehrmacht had allocated per man per day in Normandy. Across the table, a prisoner named Hoffmann was crying. Not loudly, just tears moving silently down his face into the mashed potatoes. Müller understood. Hoffmann had been in captivity for 13 months. North Africa, Algeria, the Atlantic. 13 months of not knowing whether each morning was his last. Now he was eating apple pie in Texas. An American private asked if anyone wanted seconds. No one moved. The translator repeated the question in German. Schmidt, the Luftwaffe mechanic from the next bunk, stood up. He returned with a full plate of roast beef. No forms, no ration card. Just more food. The first crack appeared. Not in their bodies, but in their certainties. That night, Müller wrote to his parents in Stuttgart. He told them he was healthy, 3 meals a day. He did not tell them he was eating better food as a prisoner than he had eaten during his entire time in the Wehrmacht. That detail seemed cruel. His family was surviving on rationed food in a city, being bombed flat. The food was not a strategy, not calculated to impress. It was just what American military standards required. And that, it turned out, was the most devastating fact of all. The shocks came in waves, not sudden revelations, a slow, relentless accumulation. Each new thing they witnessed was unremarkable to the Americans around them. Each was incomprehensible to the Germans. And the gap between those two reactions was the most devastating lesson of all. The train journey inward. They had expected boxcars, the 40 and 8 wagons the Wehrmacht used to move Soviet prisoners. 40 men or 8 horses per car. Cattle transport. They got Pullman coaches. Cushioned seats that converted to sleeping berths. Dining cars with white tablecloths and silver cutlery. Observation cars with panoramic windows. One American sergeant apologized that the air conditioning wasn't working properly. Air conditioning. In August. The prisoners had believed such luxury existed only on Hitler's personal train. 3 days from Norfolk to Texas. 3 days pressing their faces against the glass, watching an America that simply could not exist. Every small town at midnight blazed with electric light. Shop windows, house lights burning in multiple rooms, factories running night shifts, parking lots full of workers' personal automobiles. In Germany, the Volkswagen, promised to the German people since 1934, had delivered fewer than 1,000 civilian units, ever. Here, dock laborers drove to work in their own cars. The waste was magnificent. They left lights burning in empty buildings. Electric fans ran in vacant rooms. It was the carelessness of infinite resource. Feldwebel Hinrich Müller. The factories. And then the train slowed near Detroit. And the prisoners saw Willow Run. It was visible from miles away. Not because it was tall, because it was enormous. Ford's Willow Run plant. 2.5 million square feet of floor space. A single factory building larger than some German cities' industrial districts. It was producing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. 42,000 workers. 1.5 million components. 1,500 subcontractors across 32 states. Feeding into this one building. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann watched 17 B-24s in various stages of completion as the train passed. He counted them. Twice. He said nothing for several minutes. We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, that they would fall apart in combat. But I could see the precision of the assembly lines. These were not inferior aircraft. They were simply built faster than we could imagine possible. Oberleutnant Erich Hoffmann, Republic Steel, Ohio. 10,000 tons of steel per day. One plant, more than the entire Ruhr Valley at peak production. Prisoners who had worked in German industry stood at the train windows in silence. There was nothing to say. The food waste. But it was not the factories that broke something fundamental. It was the waste. At a Campbell soup factory in New Jersey, prisoners watched one elderly woman, monitoring automated equipment that would have required 50 workers in Germany, while listening to the radio, drinking coffee. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked fruit in orchards that ran to the horizon. They watched perfectly good produce discarded for minor cosmetic flaws. Entire crops plowed back into the earth. To keep market prices stable. They destroyed food to keep prices stable. Mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits because they had too many. We begged to send them to Germany, to our families. The waste was strategic proof of unlimited resources. Greifer, Otto Schultz, German families were surviving on 1,200 calories a day, and American farmers were destroying crops to manage surpluses. These were not two sides of the same war. They were two different worlds. The Freedom at Work sites across Texas, the prisoners encountered something no production statistic could have prepared them for. American farmers criticized their government openly, without lowering their voices. At a farm near Bryan, Texas, documented in FBI reports declassified in the 1970s, a farmer told a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell. He faced no consequences. He ate his lunch and went back to work. In Nazi Germany, this was a death sentence. At the King Ranch near Kingsville, 825,000 acres, larger than Rhode Island, German prisoners worked alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and black ranch hands. Not in parallel, not in separate sections, together. They were watching a world that their ideology specifically said could not function. It was functioning better than anything they had ever seen. The shadow war inside the wire. But here is what the textbooks leave out. The camps were not peaceful places of gradual awakening. They were pressure vessels. Inside the compounds, a second power structure operated. Hardcore Nazi loyalists ran internal surveillance, intimidation, punishment. They watched who spoke too warmly to American guards, who requested certain books, who asked too many questions about democracy. And they acted. Werner Drexler was a U-boat sailor who had cooperated with American interrogators. In March 1944, he was transferred to Camp Papago Park, Arizona. Within hours of arrival, fellow prisoners recognized him. He was dead before the next morning. 7 men were tried and executed for his murder in August 1945. The largest wartime execution of Axis prisoners in American history. The non-political majority watched. They felt the threat, and they kept their doubts behind their eyes, where the enforcers couldn't reach them. For now. But here is what those loyalists never understood. The minds they were trying so hard to protect were already being changed. Not by propaganda, not by force, by something they had no defense against at all. The escape that proved everything. December 23, 1944, Camp Papago Park, Arizona. 25 German prisoners executed the largest POW escape in American history. A 176-foot tunnel. Months of planning. Wehrmacht precision. The escape route would take them to the Gila River, float it down to Mexico. Freedom. They emerged from the tunnel into the cold Arizona night. 25 men, breathing free air, certain of the plan. The Gila River was dry, not low, not shallow, bone dry, a sandy desert wash, stretching to the dark horizon. They were all recaptured within days. Cold, starving, exhausted. Some turned themselves in. Perfect planning. Absolute conviction. A river that didn't exist. These were men operating on certainty. The same certainty that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe. Every calculation correct. Every step executed flawlessly. And the foundational premise turned out to be fantasy. Now, here is where the story becomes something different from a war story. Here is where it becomes something almost impossible to believe. The U.S. Army had been running a secret program since 1943. The Special Projects Division, as its purpose, ideological transformation. It did not use propaganda. It did not use pressure. It used exposure. Anti-Nazi prisoners were carefully identified through letters, book choices, reactions to news of German defeats. They were quietly elevated to positions of influence. Barracks leaders, newspaper editors, discussion group moderators. Major McKnight reported in November 1944, 60% of non-political prisoners showed measurable movement toward democratic ideals after just 6 months. Not propaganda. Society. The society was doing the work. The camp library at Herne had grown to 5,000 volumes. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain. Remarks, All Quiet on the Western Front. Works by Jewish authors whose books had been burned in German city squares. A German prisoner could read, in an American prison camp, books whose possession would have meant arrest or death back home. Let that sit. And then came Christmas, 1943. And the thing that shattered what the factories and the food could not. American churches, schools, and civic organizations sent 500,000 Christmas packages to German prisoners, men who had been trying to kill American soldiers 6 months earlier. The local Methodist choir in Herne, Texas, learned German Christmas carols phonetically. Mrs. Sarah Patterson, choir director, mother of a son serving in Italy, against German forces, stood before the assembled prisoners and led her choir in Stille Nacht, in German, for enemies. Guard reports document multiple prisoners weeping openly during the performance. These people whose sons we had tried to kill gave us gifts, and their kindness wasn't weakness, but strength. The confidence of victors who knew they had already won. Not just the war, but the peace that would follow. Hermann Butcher, Memoir, 1952. Then came the 1944 presidential election. Roosevelt faced a serious wartime challenge from Thomas Dewey. Republicans openly criticized war management. Newspapers mocked the commander-in-chief. Political cartoons ran freely in publications prisoners could read. The war effort continued, then strengthened. Democracy was not weakened by its chaos. It was powered by it. We were told America was a mongrel nation, weak, divided, incapable of military prowess. Every day I am here, I see the opposite. This is the most organized, unified, and powerful nation on earth. We were told fairy tales by criminals. Lieutenant Hermann Guts, letter-passing American censors. In 1944, by March 1945, over 25,000 prisoners had volunteered for democracy courses. Officers who had sworn personal oaths to Adolf Hitler were writing essays on constitutional government. Fewer than 10% still held strong Nazi beliefs. They hadn't been broken. They hadn't been brainwashed. They had simply been shown how the world actually worked, and they couldn't unsee it. Between 1945 and 1946, 371,683 German prisoners were repatriated. They returned to a Germany divided, destroyed, and destitute. The cities were rubble. The currency was failing. Everything they had known was gone. But they carried something back that no bomb could take. Hans Kroll, prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West German ambassador to the United States. Walter Hallstein, who taught classes at a POW camp, became the first president of the European Commission, and 48 former POWs elected to the Bundestag. 312 became mayors or city councilors. Nearly 2,000 worked in German agricultural modernization, applying methods learned on farms in Minnesota and Texas. We returned from America with more than memories. We brought knowledge of how democracy functions, how free markets operate, how diverse peoples cooperate. We had seen the future, and we knew it worked. Hans-Georg von Studnitz, 1965. The West German economic miracle of the 1950s, the Wirtschaftswunder, was built on foundations that included knowledge brought home in the minds of former prisoners. Men who had learned, not from lectures but from evidence, that prosperity comes not from conquest but from productivity, not from racial hierarchy, but from human dignity. Of those 425,000 prisoners, 5,000 eventually immigrated to America. Thousands more maintained correspondence with American families for 30, 40, 50 years. Hans Müller, the tank gunner from Stuttgart, who had calculated calories at a prison camp dinner table, farmed in Minnesota for 43 years. 3 children, a woman named Margaret. He became an American citizen on April 12, 1952. Raised his right hand in a courthouse in Fort Dodge, Iowa, recited an oath to a country he had spent 2 years fighting against. The judge looked at him and said, "Welcome home, Mr. Mueller." He sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long time, then wept. Not from sadness, from the weight of a second chance he had never earned, and somehow received. He never returned to Germany. And then there is Georg Gartner. Gartner escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico, and in September 1945, not fleeing the country, choosing to disappear into it. He lived under an assumed name for 40 years, married an American woman, raised American children, worked as a tennis instructor in California. When he finally surrendered in 1985, he had been American for longer than he had been German. He didn't escape from America. He escaped to it. Austin, Texas, 1985. 40 years after the war's end. More than 500 former German prisoners returned to America that year. They came back to the towns and farms and cities where their transformation had begun. To the fields they had hoed under a Texas sun. To the logging camps in Minnesota. To the mess halls where something had shifted in them, so deeply that 40 years had not moved it. Some had not spoken of their captivity in decades, as some wept on the plane before they landed. Former Oberst Hermann Butcher, 78 years old, captured in 1943 as a fanatical Nazi loyalist, stood at the podium of the Austin reunion dinner. The room was silent. We came to America as enemies, as Nazis, as believers in a lie. We left as friends, as Democrats, as men who had seen the truth. America showed us that strength comes not from conquest, but from production. Not from hatred, but from diversity. Not from tyranny, but from freedom. We returned to Germany with a mission: to build a society that could create rather than destroy. The Germany that rose from the ashes was built on lessons learned in American prison camps. We who came as conquerors left as students. To America, from your former enemies, now your friends. Thank you for showing us the way. Oberst Hermann Butcher, Austin Reunion, 1985. The auditorium erupted. Americans and Germans together, standing. Former enemies, on the same side of something. Hold this final image. June 1943. A train pulling into Mexia, Texas. Deep dark, summer night. 1,850 Afrika Korps veterans stepping onto American soil, certain of German superiority, certain of American weakness, certain of everything they had ever been told. And the lights. Electric lights blazing from every farmhouse, every shop window, every street corner. A constellation of illumination stretching across the Texas plains, horizon to horizon. In Germany, blackout regulations had plunged the Reich into darkness since 1940. Rural electrification had reached barely 20% of German farms. Here, the lights burned in every direction at 10 o'clock on a summer night. It's unremarkable. Normal. Just Tuesday in Texas. They never went out. The most powerful weapon America deployed in World War II was not the B-24, not the Liberty ship, not the atomic bomb. It was the simple, overwhelming, undeniable evidence of what a free society looks like when it is running at full power, and the willingness to let its enemies see it. Hermann Butcher arrived in America as an enemy. He left as a witness to something he could never fully explain. If this story moves something in you, if you found yourself thinking about what it means to change your mind, to have your certainties dismantled by simple reality, then you already understand why this channel exists. Hit like. Not for the algorithm. Because somewhere in those 371,000 men is a story that deserves to be remembered. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We find these buried stories every week as ones that fell through the cracks of official history, the human moments that explain the world better than any textbook. The next one is already waiting. Don't miss it. Thank you for watching.